Hundreds of illegal immigrants are refusing to leave hotels across Manhattan, where New York City Mayor Eric Adams is housing them on taxpayer dime. The U.S. House of Representatives has voted on two bills pertaining to COVID-19 that await approval by the Senate. The media shamelessly makes the tragic killing of Tyree Nichols about race. And I interview John Agresto, the author of a new book called The Death of Learning, and we discuss the failings in American education. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Friends, it is Thursday, February 2nd, 2023, and here is the news that you need to know today. Starting off with a story in New York City, hundreds of illegal immigrants are refusing to leave hotels across Manhattan, where they are being housed thanks to New York City Mayor Eric Adams' new policy of allowing these illegal immigrants to stay in various hotels across the city instead of in shelters where the protocol says that they belong. So most of these hotels are not allowing regular guests to stay on the premises because every single room is occupied by these illegal immigrants. And so there have been testimonials from hotel employees that these immigrants are wreaking havoc inside of the hotels, A, because they are refusing to leave, and B, because, in the words of one employee, it's become a free-for-all. According to Felipe Rodriguez, who's an employee at the Row Hotel in the Upper West Side, he said that many of these illegal immigrants are destroying the hotel rooms. They are bringing in drugs and alcohol into the rooms. And he says that teenagers are going into the staircases and making out like it's Lover's Lane. Again, he said it's a free-for-all. And according to another employee who remains anonymous at the Watson Hotel in Brooklyn, the same thing is going on, where people are knocking on doors telling these illegal immigrants that they need to leave and go to shelters, and they are refusing to stay there because they like hotel life better than they like staying in a shelter. Now, what this man, Felipe Rodriguez of the Row Hotel, said in one of his statements really resonated with me. He said, a lot of this burden is falling on us, the hotel employees. The people who are making these policies don't have to deal with the havoc that is being wreaked. And I think that is such an important point to highlight. I, on this show, I think it was last week, told you all a story about when I went to a supermarket and there was a homeless man there who looked very menacing, and he was pacing up and down one of the aisles, and he had a knife in his pocket. A small one, I will admit, but still, it was a knife. And he's opening it and closing it and opening it and closing it. And I was just so afraid. The people who were in the checkout line with me were all kind of eyeing him, and we were afraid. And as I was walking out of the supermarket, one of the managers was standing near the door. And I said to her, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that this guy is just allowed to be in here." And she said, "I try to call the police. The police tell us that there's nothing that they can do about it. They're short-staffed and they have to follow, other more egregious instances of crime." And she's told me, "I am afraid every single day of my job." And this is what I wish everyday Americans, and especially people in my generation who are overwhelmingly left-wing, realized. People who make these policies, like allowing illegal immigrants to stay in hotels or defunding the police, the people who are making those policies will never, ever have to experience the consequences of those laws. It is everyday blue-collar employees, hotel workers, supermarket managers who bear the brunt of it. And that is just the epitome of elitism. So New York City Mayor Eric Adams has not said anything about what he plans to do with these illegal immigrants. They're not citizens, so it's hard to sort of go through a standard process of arresting them for trespassing or for overstaying their welcome. It's hopelessly convoluted, but what it indicates, again, is that the people in charge are not reliable. They are not anything close to being smart, and all of this is being funded on the taxpayer dime. Every day, hardworking Americans are having to pay for and subsidize these immigrants in hotel rooms. And it is not bigoted to say that that is ridiculous and to oppose it. In other news, the United States House of Representatives, which is primarily Republican controlled, has voted on 2 bills pertaining to COVID that await approval, although that approval is unlikely, in the Democrat-led United States Senate. So the first bill to know here is that the Republicans and some Democrats who joined them in voting voted to terminate the government-issued COVID-19 health emergency immediately. And this is called the Pandemic is Over Act, and it was passed in the United States House by 220 votes to 210 opposing votes. And as I said, this will go to the Senate, but since the Senate is overwhelmingly Democrat-controlled, it probably won't get passed. Now, some of you may have seen in the news that President Biden a few days ago said that the COVID-19 emergency will end on May 11th, 2023, but this is after he had already extended it to January 11th of this year. We don't know if he really means it and he will end it on May 11th or if he's going to extend it further. But for all of you wondering, why are we still declaring this an emergency? It's because by keeping this emergency order alive, it empowers the president and other lawmakers to do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do in a state of non-emergency. For example, President Biden's student loan forgiveness program, which he has tried to pass into law, but luckily is receiving some blocking, that is something that he passed into law only because he was given the emergency decree because of the pandemic. So even though student loans have nothing to do with COVID-19, he was given more executive power because the United States was in a state of emergency, and then he used that power to initiate this program, which he knew would never be passed if it originated in the United States House of Representatives and had to be voted on by both branches of Congress. So that's bill number 1, to immediately terminate this health emergency. Bill number 2 is called the Freedom for Healthcare Workers Act. And it was passed with 7 Democrats that joined Republicans. And if it passes in the Senate and is passed into law, it will end the vaccine requirement for healthcare workers. Now, this is really important because it was once understood earlier in the pandemic by actually both sides, believe it or not, that it might be a good thing for healthcare workers to have to be required to be vaccinated, because if they're dealing with patients, it's only fair that they shouldn't be able to pass on COVID to those patients. But in recent weeks and months, we have learned from big pharma executives themselves that at the time of the rollout of the vaccine, they didn't know if it prevented transmissibility. And the evidence indicates now that, in fact, it doesn't. We have a clip. Well, I should ask Sean, do we have the clip? Did you pull it? Excellent. We have a clip from a Pfizer executive who testified before the European Parliament in October of last year. And she said, again, at the time of the rollout, Pfizer had no evidence that its vaccine prevented transmissibility. Let's listen.
Vaccine tested on stopping the transmission of the virus before it entered the market. If not, please say it clearly. If yes, are you willing to share the data with this committee? And I really want a straight answer, yes or no, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Regarding the question around, did we know about stopping immunisation before it entered the market? No. We had to really move at the speed of science to really understand what is taking place in the market. And from that point of view, we had to do everything at risk.
It's a pretty shocking but honest admission by this Pfizer executive. And I cannot help but wonder if these bills were passed in large part because of the story that I reported on 2 days ago, where a Pfizer executive thanks to a undercover journalism operation headed by Project Veritas, was admitting to someone who he thought he was on a date with that Pfizer is considering mutating the virus in order to preemptively create more vaccines. It seems that as more shady information comes out about Big Pharma and about the negative effects of the vaccine, the more legislation that is coming to the fore to try to reverse some of these requirements and restrictions that were enacted at the beginning of the pandemic. Just my little speculation. So we will see whether the Senate approves it, both of these bills, but as I mentioned, it's unlikely. And finally, I'd like to talk a bit about the media's response to the tragic killing of Tyree Nichols, a black man who was beaten to death by 5 black police officers in Memphis, Tennessee. It's amazing how the mainstream media these days makes everything about race. You see the way that the New York Times or CNN has been reporting on this, and they are saying that even though it was 5 black cops against a black man, this proves that there is racism. I don't understand how they make that argument, but nevertheless, they do. And we see that they just apply race. They view life through this lens of race, and they apply it to everything. They immediately, for instance, applied race with the death of George Floyd. Now, of course, when there's a white cop who kills a black man, it's much more of an understandable intellectual jump to think that there might have been racism involved. But they immediately pegged it as a racially motivated crime. The media could not consider the possibility that maybe Derek Chauvin behaved the way that he behaved because he had personal animus towards George Floyd that had nothing to do with Floyd's race. We know that Chauvin and Floyd worked together before that incident. They were both bodyguards at a nightclub. And again, people just couldn't comprehend the idea that maybe they disliked each other that had nothing to do with the fact that Chauvin was a white guy and George Floyd was a black guy. Look, it could have been a racially motivated crime. We don't know. The only way we would be able to know that is if we got into the head of Derek Chauvin, which obviously we are not able to do. But the problem is when the media sees everything through the lens of race, when they immediately cry racism at all of these instances, they make the incident about race and not about evil, which is really the problem here. And when you don't focus on the existence of evil and how evil those cops were in their killing of Tyree Nichols, then you make an instance like that a societal problem versus a shabby human nature problem. And when you make it a societal problem, you see all of these people proposing societal solutions that just don't work. For instance, in the wake of George Floyd's death, we know that many activists proposed putting body cameras on police officers, which, by the way, is a great thing to do. Every police officer should have a body camera on. But you look at here with the beating of Tyree Nichols, all of those cops had body cameras on, and it didn't prevent them from doing what they did. Similarly, we hear a lot of people talking about how police officers need more training. But then you see here with this instance of Tyree Nichols, these police officers didn't even make an attempt to adhere to any kind of protocol in the first place. It's not like they were trying to de-escalate the situation and then just ditched their protocol. They just started beating the guy immediately, which again shows that this is an evil problem. This is a bad people problem, not a societal issue. And when we focus on making it a societal issue, we have this way of sort of excusing by not focusing on the malignant behavior of individuals. And in addition to this instance reflecting evil, it also reflects the dangers of groupthink. And this is a subject that I want to do an entire show on, or entire timeless topic on, the power of groupthink. People do things in groups that they would never do individually. And we see this across the board. The most obvious example is sororities and fraternities. We see people in the hazing process who do crazy things that they would never do on their own, and they are more likely to drink excessively or do things like take drugs because they're in a group setting and people are pushing them to do it, and they see one guy doing it and they go, okay, well, if he's doing it, then I can do it. And it's the same thing with bad behavior. People play off of the bad behavior of others. And we saw that with George Floyd's killing too. Derek Chauvin put the knee on the neck, but there were other cops standing next to Derek Chauvin who just stood there silently. And in a way, made it easier for Derek Chauvin to do that horrible, unnecessary, egregious act because his colleagues were not intervening. They were just standing in silence. And one of the most obvious examples of this groupthink idea is the Rodney King killings in the 1990s, which we know were racially motivated, where LAPD officers were beating and screaming slurs at Rodney King. People in groups are always going to behave worse than individually. And it's just stunning how we don't see the media talking about these components of human nature, because society is going to get better if we focus on the shabby parts of human nature and we try to correct those and punish people when they behave malignantly, instead of saying that this is a societal problem with only societal solutions. In my opinion, one of the most regrettable things about contemporary American culture is how infrequently we all read and listen to music and view great pieces of art. We in 2023, sometimes we forget this, but we are at a unique point in history where we have unprecedented access to these great masterpieces of our history. If you think about it, the printing press wasn't invented until about 600 years ago. And before that, people couldn't read a wide variety of work. In many cases, people were totally unaware of great pieces of literature that existed. And similarly, people couldn't see great works of art because museums didn't exist. You had to be rich and at the right party, at the right estate or mansion in order to see a great piece of art. Or you couldn't listen to music because we didn't have the technology to be able to disseminate those pieces of music. But now we can order Shakespeare on Amazon and have it at our front doorstep the next morning. We can go onto Google and look up great pieces of music. We can go to a local museum and look at a great piece of art. But it seems that as we progressively have gotten more access to these things, we seem to be less interested in consuming them. There are many reasons for why this may be the case. Certainly, our reliance on and obsession with technology is a big contributor. But in my view, this principally reflects a failing in American education. Today, I have the joy of speaking with John Agresto, an American educator who recently published a book on this subject called The Death of Learning: How American Education Has Failed Our Students and What to Do About It. And you can see here that I loved this book so much that I have 2 copies of it, one with a cover and then one without a cover that I have heavily annotated. And I read this book a few weeks ago, and when I was about halfway through it, I wrote in the margins in big capital letters, I underlined and starred this sentence. I wrote, "I wish I had read this book before college." Mr. Agresto has taught at the University of Toronto, Kenyon College, and Duke University, to name a few. He was the president of St. John's College in Santa Fe for 11 years. And in the early 2000s, he went to the Middle East, where he served as the academic dean and the chancellor of the American University in Iraq. In his book, Mr. Agresto discusses how liberal education, and we'll define what that is, but for now I will just preliminarily define it as a worldly education, learning about English and history and art, how this liberal education has rapidly declined in the United States. Students no longer see the use in studying things like English or art history, but rather they want to attain practical and useful skills that will help them in their careers. According to the United States Department of Education, the foremost major chosen by undergraduates today is business. In a recent year, 300,000 undergraduate degrees were given in business, with only 37,000 in philosophy, English, and history combined. This situation is even worse in graduate schools. 42% of all master's degrees awarded in 2018 and 2019 were concentrated in education and business. Mr. Agresto argues in his book that the liberal arts have died not by murder, but by suicide. As I mentioned, students don't see the utility or the practical usefulness in studying great works of literature. But also, Mr. Agresto focuses on a point that particularly resonated with me, that many teachers and professors, despite having the best of intentions, have killed the delight and the sense of wonder that one can feel when reading great books by analyzing them to death, by focusing on literary concepts and critiques, and more commonly unpacking the social, political, or economic implications of the book. And Mr. Agresto says what a shame that is. These writers didn't write to be analyzed. They wrote primarily to impart to us eternal messages, to ignite a sense of wonder and delight. In one of my favorite passages of the book, Mr. Agresto writes, "Historical, social, or economic reductions, using history, society, or social status as an explanatory vehicle for a text, distances the text for our students. It makes it other, a museum piece. By contextualizing everything, we set up a barrier to learning from the men, women, and events of the past, since we do not inhabit their universe. If what Dante wrote and did and thought, he wrote, did, and thought because he was a late medieval Florentine, if we can only truly understand him by understanding how he was a product of or reflected his time and place, then he can teach us very little, since we do not inhabit this world." Mr. Agresto, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much, Julie. It took me 250 pages to say what you just said. So next time, could I ask you to be my editor next time?
Sure. Are you planning on writing a subsequent book about this subject?
All I do is write books, Julie.
Well, I know from your bio that you have published, this is 5. This is your 5th one. I've got that right?
Yeah.
So
I'm thinking my next book, I'm thinking of pulling together all the essays that I've written on education and politics and history, and just see if anybody would buy a book of all my essays. Probably, maybe you would, but maybe might be the end of it. But I'm going to do it.
I certainly would. And as I told you off the air before this interview, I am already planning on giving your book, The Death of Learning, to many of my family friends who are graduating from college and going on to high school, because I think it is that important. So if you wrote a book with those essays, I would do the same. I would hand them out to any high schooler who would read them.
Great. Thank you. No, that was a wonderful introduction you gave me. Better than I deserved.
So what impelled you to write this book? I mentioned that you have taught at several universities. You were the president of a university for 11 years. But why now? Why in 2022 did you write this?
Well, while it may be true that I wrote the end of it in 2022, I started writing this book. Do you know how old I am? I started writing this book back in the 1980s, maybe even late 70s. And because I started teaching in the early mid 70s, and I looked around and I saw, and then liberal education really was more current and more prevalent, is what I mean to say, in colleges and universities. And I just started to see not only that it was waning, but that those who taught the liberal arts we're making it dull, we're making it political, we're making it uninteresting to students, and didn't know what students were really looking for. And then one of my professors from graduate school was Alan Bloom, who wrote The Closing of the American Mind. And there was a slight flourishing of liberal education after he wrote the book, and then even that died down. And so I've been, over the years, just adding chapter to chapter to chapter to this book. And what convinced me to do it was I think we in the academy and many people in high schools are just doing it wrong. Uh, it's not that we tend to blame everything else for why kids aren't studying English or history, why they become dumber about things that matter, or not, less educated about things that matter. When indeed, half the problem, if not more than half, is us. We in the academy have killed the liberal arts.
So before we proceed with this discussion, let's set the table a little bit. Can you please define liberal arts?
No, you only have an hour.
In 3 sentences, a primer.
The easiest way you would understand it, people would understand it, is the way the Academy puts it. Liberal arts tend to be those things that are not practical, not pre-professional, not pre-medical, but in fact, the liberal arts are study of history, Western civilization, English, American literature, world history, philosophy, languages and literature, the old arts and sciences that used to be the most prevalent thing on university campuses. Some places would have religious studies as well. Other places would have some psychology or anthropology. Those things that teach us about the universe and teach us about the things that humans have made and done, their art, their history, and their products. That's what makes up the liberal arts. History, English, philosophy, classics, Latin and Greek, French and Spanish. Those are the liberal, and math and science as well.
So let's talk about the usefulness of liberal arts. And that word, usefulness or practicality, you talk about a lot in the book, because as I indicated in the introduction, and as I saw throughout my time in college, people take courses or they major in subjects that they think will help them in their careers. And they have to see a direct line between what they learn and how it's going to help them later in life. So I want you, because you describe it so well in the book, I would love for you to describe it to my audience. What is useful about the liberal arts? I will start this discussion, though, by talking about a quote in your book that I really loved. You said, you were explaining the background of the term liberal arts. And you say that it's called liberal because it has this connection to the word liberty, which obviously means to be free. And you say, sure, this once meant that the liberal arts were studies that were pursued by free men, by citizens that had the time and the leisure to bury their heads in books. But then you say, liberal arts are not just the studies that are the domain of free men, but they are also the studies that help make men free. How do they help make men free?
We all live in a culture, in a society, in a civilization, and in a world where so many of the questions that we have are already answered. Our country answers them, our parents answer them, our religion answers them, our peers answer them, and the truth is that liberal arts will say to the interested student, stop for a second and see what people not of your tribe, of your country, of your culture, of your religion, or of your peer group may say about things that are really important. And I do believe that there is something in everybody until it gets killed, generally by, well, never mind. It gets buried by people saying, "Oh, this is what you should do. You should major in accounting." Or you say, "What I really want to know if what the rabbi or the priest tells me is true. I want to think about that." Or I really want to know when they say modern music is really all we need to know. What's this Mozart and Beethoven and Bartok and Palestrina? Can I study art? Would I learn something from it? And the answer is, people will say, "Oh, don't bother. But pick out your career pattern. and follow that. How how what a disservice we do to kids when we say, you already know what you want to be, or maybe your parents know what you want to be. Just do that. It's secure. Well, the heck, it is not secure. If you don't have a good, broad, liberal education that will see you through rough times, and no matter what career you finally envision and finally take, you've just been cheated in your life. Don't think you know what you want to do when you're 18 years old. You don't know what you're going to be. You don't know what the opportunities are. You're not prepared in your mind or your imagination to meet those opportunities, and nor are you prepared to be a good citizen of where you are. Okay, go back to the question you asked. How does it make us free? It makes us free because it tells us that that here are the tools for thinking about the most important thing. You think you know what justice is? Maybe you do. The only way to test it is to read what Plato and Socrates, or what Aristotle, or what the Bible says, or what other philosophers say, and then also compare that to what you believe, or what your peers believe, or what your culture believes. You think you know what it means to be free? Think about there are ways of thinking about that. Do you have you have an attraction to democracy, or you may have an attraction to autocracy? Let's think about this. There are books, and I once heard someone saying it's absolutely true. The person who doesn't read is no better off than the person who can't read. Uh, and, and if you don't read, if you don't read, you won't be able to consider. If you don't read, you won't be able to think about the important things. And in studying these things, you will know more about what you might want to do. Uh, the truth is, Julie, I like to cook. Uh, why do I like to cook? Well, because I really loved chemistry. I got flummoxed a little bit by organic chemistry, but then I realized that cooking was nothing more but the combination of things to produce a third thing. That's what we're doing in chemistry. Uh, uh, I love gardening, but this means that I had to learn an awful lot about uh, about soil science, about botany, about meteorology. There are all kinds of subjects out there. I see a picture of books going by there in a library. What we can learn by studying the liberal arts is incredible, and they enrich our lives. We don't have to just be an accountant, although it's perfectly fine to be an accountant. Can't get along. I can't get along without them. We don't just have to be a cook or a lawyer or a school teacher. We can be a living, breathing, thinking human being. And another way, and this was the great contribution in a sense of Alan Bloom. Unless it gets killed, everybody around the ages of 16, 17, 18, 20 have yearnings. Everybody wants to know the truth about important things. And education used to be a place where you could go and at least begin to find out the truth about these things. Not what other people's opinions are, but to read about what their opinions were, or indeed what their arguments, what their viewpoints, what their reasons were. Read about those things and come to your own conclusions, make up your own mind. And so the first thing, to go back to what you said before, the first thing liberal arts do is they're the freeing arts. They free us not to live in the cave of other people's opinions, but to see the light as best we can. Having said that, Julie, the amazing thing about the liberal arts is that on one hand they're the most liberating thing, and on the other hand they're the most conservative thing. They're the things that preserve Shakespeare and Homer and Rembrandt. They're the things that preserve, Mozart and Bach. They're the things that preserve the wealth, the treasures of this civilization and other civilizations. So it has It's the most incredible thing, liberal education. It liberates the mind, and it preserves the riches of civilization. It tells the story not just of the great things that people have done, it tells the story of the horrible things people have done. And believe me, you have to know that too.
I have a quote here. You said liberal arts aim at once to be truly radical and truly conservative. It's what you just said. As an education, they aim at teaching every student to think independently, to constantly ask why, to search out arguments and reasons rather than rest on received opinion. And yet, a liberal education also grasps that what came before needs to be known now, that civilization and culture didn't just spring up yesterday, and that wisdom today grows out of what generations long dead have learned. You talked about in the book how Stanford University used to have a Western civilization course that was required for all freshmen. And then in the late 1980s, I believe you said it was, kicked out because it was too Eurocentric. And you argue in the book, I thought it was very well said, people first need to understand what is theirs. They need to understand their own inheritance, and then a necessary component, but a secondary component is then they have to understand what isn't theirs. So I thought that was really, really crucial for us all to understand, and it shows how intellectually shallow this argument about Eurocentrism is. I'm sure that people, who learn about their own societies across the world, they don't, Asian countries don't call themselves Asian-centric or African-centric. It's not, centric in a bad way to learn first and foremost about your own roots. That's your foundation to then learn about other things and to compare to other things.
Absolutely. Now you see why I'd rather write than speak. Those things you picked out really very nice that I said. And the other thing to say about Stanford, it wasn't alone. It was the sort of the poster child for ditching Western civilization in the universities. But Western civilization was we used to talk about core courses, was the core of core courses at almost every college and university. And after Stanford made such a deal about how it slighted women, because while in literature there might be wonderful things written by women, where were the women composers, or where were the women philosophers? Oh, we're not going to teach music history, and we're not going to teach philosophy, and the same goes with different ethnic groups. And Stanford at least talked a good game about what we're doing is we're adding to the knowledge that Americans have by becoming more multicultural. But then it didn't work out that way. Basically, what we did was we jettisoned the study of Western civilization, and now we have all these, studies, women's studies, black studies, Chicano studies. We even have whiteness studies, which is a thing and a strange duck in its own way. What kids would learn from the study of Western civilization was a lot more than just the names of the kings and queens of England. They learned an awful lot about what humanity does, the great things it's capable of doing, the horrors it's capable of doing, what leads up to those things, what's the consequence of that. It shows you the growth of liberalism, of liberal democracy, shows you the growth of democracy, shows you the growth of liberal economics, shows you the growth of the rule of law, shows you all kinds. I'm a political scientist, so I gravitate towards those things, but it shows you the development of art. It shows you everything that has made this country and this civilization what it is. And I just can't believe that you go through life, if you know no history, and you would know this, Julie, as well as anyone. If you know no history, you have no idea what the human heart is like and what it's capable of doing and thinking.
Right. And one of the things that you argue is that this is not just merely interesting. I mean, it is, of course, interesting to learn about these things, but it also is, to use our favorite words, practical and useful to understand human nature, to understand history. And you imparted this really well in the preface of your book when you talk about your time in Iraq, which I want to ask you more about because it sounds so interesting. But you say that you were asked by 3 students at this American university that you helped to found in Iraq a question. They were freshmen, you write, and they had been studying long sections of Greek history. And they said, Dr. John, we have a question and we need to know, are you an Athenian or a Spartan? You wrote, what a lovely question, I thought. So I answered, oh, I hope I'm an Athenian, charming, cultured, civic-minded. I wouldn't want to be a Spartan, gruff, warlike. And they responded, no, Dr. John, we don't mean you. We mean you Americans. Will America stand by us, or will you betray us as the Spartans betrayed their friends and allies? What will America do if we're no longer convenient for you? And then you write, and I know I'm quoting you a lot, but all of these passages are so important. I love this next sentence you say. You said, it was then that it became clear that history was not to these new students an academic study, but had real meaning for both life and death. There were aspects to the liberal arts that had them think, worry, consider, and plan. As I mentioned to you off the air, I majored in history in college, and one of the principal reasons, I should probably say the sole reason why I did it, is because I just have always thought that history is fascinating. But it's sort of a luxury to go, if you're me, to go into college and just want to study history because it's fascinating. We Americans forget that in addition to being interesting, we have a responsibility to learn history. We have to understand it because that will inform the way that we live in the future, and it will also inform how our society is shaped in the future. And we forget that things like history are practical.
No, absolutely. I mean, what these students understood in Iraq was that there wasn't a ghost of a chance that they could have studied history, not even Iraqi history, under Saddam Hussein. At least not legitimate history, not history or real history. Not a chance in the world that they could study world literature, American literature, European literature, or even I tried to talk to them about 1001 Nights. They said, "Oh, that's Persian literature. We don't study that." Although I did have, I went to visit an orphanage once in Baghdad, and they said, and they spoke very good English actually. They were taught English at a young age. Saddam knew that English was the language of the world in a sense. It was the new Latin was English, and he had kids learn it. And I said, "Well, what are you reading?" He says, "We're reading Dickens and Shakespeare." And I said, wow, I'm absolutely amazed. I mean, these are, 12, 13, 10, 11-year-old kids. And they said, yes, we're reading about this awful man, Fagin, in Dickens. He was a Jew, and we're reading about this awful man, Shylock, in Shakespeare. He was a Jew. That's what Saddam thought he could get away with by introducing them to what we would consider to be reasonably good literature, Merchant of Venice, and just the kids there. Once we went there and we said, look, you could read history, you could read philosophy, you could read poetry. I remember once one of my translators, we were talking about Robert Frost. I'm sorry, about Joyce Kilmer. No, I'm sorry, Robert Frost. Talking about Robert Frost, and he says, you get that poem, "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening," where he says, to the road divided in two, and I took the road less traveled on, and that has made all the difference. And they said, that's us. We have to take individually and as a country the road less traveled by, and it will make all the difference. Literature meant something, and it didn't mean something political. It meant something human, history, drama. Now you were asking about Iraqis, and now I'm forgetting. It was just a delight to teach students who, as a friend of mine says, nothing's more exciting and more satisfying than teaching post-tyranny kids, and it's true. Kids who have been tyrannized over by people like Saddam, or by a professoriate that thinks that this is what you will read and this is what you will understand and this is what you will give back to me. If that's what we think of as education, then if we break those chains, kids will say, give me more history, give me some literature, give me philosophy, let me see the world, let me understand the world. And nothing is more satisfying for a professor than that. Nothing's more satisfying for a country than that.
I bet. This excessively academic approach that we have taken to literature reflects a kind of privilege, because again, we have the luxury to focus on similes and metaphors, alliteration, iambic pentameter, instead of what do we really need to learn about human nature from this text. And I want to move into this discussion of how literature specifically has become professionalized and overanalyzed. You see here that I have the book, The Scarlet Letter, on my set. And I'll tell you a personal story that I read that book in 9th grade. And I remembered two things about it: sexism and the rose bush. I remembered that Hester Prynne was this woman who had an affair, got pregnant, and the town, the Puritan Massachusetts town, ridiculed her and made her put an A on her breast. And I remember talking very much about how, of course, the woman was blamed in that time and she was publicly humiliated, and the man, went on free. And then I remembered this symbol of a rose bush because I had to write an essay on it. And I remember racking my brain and thinking about the symbolism. But after college, this past summer after I graduated, something was pulling me back to that book. I was like, I'm going to read this again. And oh my gosh, reading it the second time, I am not coming away with thinking about sexism or the rose bush. That is a masterful book. And you write about the Scarlet Letter in The Death of Learning. It says so much about human nature, about these questions of responsibility and guilt. And above all else, it teaches a really powerful lesson. And I'm sorry for the audience members who haven't read it, I'm going to spoil it. But by the end of the book, Hester has to wear this A, which stands for adulteress. And by the end of the book, people in the town forget that the A stands for adulteress, and they think that the A stands for Abel. Because Hester Prynne so transformed herself. She was wronged, she was unfairly ridiculed, but she put her head down, she went to work, she became an incredible seamstress, she became a great community member, and she transformed her sin, quote unquote sin, into something ennobling and changed her reputation. What an empowering message for a reader to learn. And it makes me sad to look back and think that I didn't glean that from the book, because with all due respect to my teachers, and I adore many of them, I have very good relationships with my high school teachers, but they were so focused on literary theory and criticism. Similarly, we read Heart of Darkness, and I remember two things: racism and rivets, this symbolism of rivets on the ship. So I'd like to ask you, why is it that teachers and professors have pursued this overly academic approach to books? Surely they entered this realm of study because they saw something beautiful and enriching in great literature. So why in turn have they not imparted that magic and sense of wonder to us, the students?
Because it's unprofessional to do what you think we should do. And I say that in the best possible way. I was talking to a high school student not too long ago, and he loved his history class. And he said, you know what? We're learning to think like a historian. We're learning to comb through facts and think put things together like historians. I said, well, what history are you learning? Are you learning any American history? He said, no, we don't care about learning from history. We're learning how to do history technically. You're being cheated. Well, as a teacher of history, you don't have to go and teach kids to be historians. You have to teach them to learn from history. You have to teach them the sweep and construct of history. You have to teach them things that happen. You have to tell them what the American Revolution, have them read and understand what the American Revolution was trying to accomplish, what the Constitutional Convention was trying to accomplish, what the Civil War was fought over, what the consequences of the Civil War were. Important things to know. Important things to know not only to be an educated human being, but because your country needs for you to know the history of the country, the history of the principles of the country, the history of what we've done and what we've left undone. Uh, uh, so go back to the Scarlet Letter. That's interesting. We were a bunch of guys. I was at a private all male, all boys high school, and we read it, and we loved Hester Prynne, but we saw her as courageous, brave, tough, uh, uh, steadfast. She had all the characters we guys wanted to have. Uh, don't think that's not something to teach kids. That you could learn. You could certainly learn from Hester Prynne how to be a guy, how to be a great human being, what the various virtues, what human excellence might really be. And the truth is that all the shallow people and all the evil people in the book were men, uh, by and large. But that's what you could learn from books. And I said we had somebody come in, a teacher who just got out of taking a graduate school course on Hawthorne, and all he could talk about was the influences on Hawthorne, who Hawthorne influenced, Hawthorne leading to Melville, transcendentalism. Who else was in the transcendental movement? What difference does it make to high school kids? Who else was in the transcendental movement? What makes a difference is what can I learn from this book that really is important to know? That's what the humanities were about. That's what the liberal arts were about. Learning about things that matter. And that we've professionalized literature. We've professionalized history. Certainly the classics. I mean, to think that the only reason to learn Latin and Greek, or to learn, let's say especially Latin, is because it'll help you on your SAT scores. Oh, come on. Yes, it will help your vocabulary immensely. Will help your vocabulary. That's not the only reason to go back and look at the Romans again.
Learning what a simile is has not helped me at all in my life.
Oh, it
Learning
should. It should help you a little bit.
well, it is yet to be seen how learning about a simile enriches my life. I'm not saying that I shouldn't have learned about it. What enriches me more with reading the Scarlet Letter is not being able to identify a simile, but being able to see Hester Prynne as a role model. And as corny as it sounds, I think about Hester Prynne 3 times a day in my life. Because when I encounter something that's difficult, or when I'm in a situation where I think I've been treated unfairly, I think about her in the way that she handled her huge miscarriage of justice. And I wish I could shake teachers and go, it is so much more important to teach the students the message of the book than this literary device. And so that's one criticism that I have of teachers, and I know you do too. One thing that you don't talk about in the book, but I'm interested to hear your opinion on, is how much reading teachers assign. You're going to think, of course, Julie, you're complaining about this, you're a typical student, but I think that teachers assign way too much reading, especially in college, as homework. And what it does is it just makes the student not want to read any of it. Whereas if they assigned smaller, more important passages, I think that we would be more likely to take a stab at it. As a former university head and professor, what is your response to me? Do I just need to work harder and do the required reading, or do you think my critique has some merit?
Has some merit. End of story. Definitely has merit. And although don't give up on similes and metaphors. I mean, the rose bush that you mentioned is a metaphor for many other things. But knowing the hard and fast difference between similes and metaphors, yeah, you should be told it. But if you don't remember it, nothing hinges on that. But okay, add to what you just said, and I agree. great books, really good books, really important books shouldn't be lumped in with other really, really important books so that everybody gets short shrift. I mean, what could be worse than to say, I would like you to read Hamlet, wonderful, wonderful drama. I'd like you to read Macbeth, fabulous play. I'd like you to read King Lear by Tuesday. And then I'll talk about Shakespeare's tragedies. No, what you want to do is you want to say, next time we're going to read King Lear, and we're going to talk about it in class. Not that I'm going to lecture you about it. I mean, I may ask a few questions. I may lead you this way or that. I may try to help you out if you get confused. But talking about it with classmates is so much more important. People say, "Well, I'm going to read all the great books." That's fine. You'll get about 10% of what you could get out of them that you would have gotten 100% out of if you were in a book club, let's say. If you had a class that was a seminar, not just a lecture. Talking about things that matter teaches you a couple of things. Not only has you hear what other people's opinions are, not only has you answer their questions or objections, it teaches you how to listen as well as how to read. It teaches how to formulate an opinion, how to make an opinion into an argument, how to make an opinion into a reasonable and reasoned argument. So there's a lot. Don't just do I believe in studying Western civilization? Yes. Do I believe we should read the great books of Western civilization? Yes. Do I believe we should take the bus trip of the West in one semester? Don't be silly. It's just that nothing is really nothing sticks, nothing sinks in, nothing's deepened by knowing the superficialities of a lot. If they're just ordinary, everyday, entertaining books, you could read a lot of them.
Right.
If they're things that really you should know, things that really are important for you to know, then you have to take your time with it.
Right. And in fairness, I think part of the reason why The Scarlet Letter made the impression on me that it did when I reread it a few months ago is because I was older. I was 22 years old versus 14 years old. And I'm really glad that I read it and that it at least was on my radar at that age. But part of this is, you as a young teenager, you don't yet have the life experience or the emotional or intellectual sophistication to truly understand or appreciate some of these books that you're assigned. Again, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be assigned them, but that's where you really do need the teacher to make the messages come alive. And sometimes I would notice that teachers would withhold telling you the message, or I mean, not that there's one message, or the messages of a book, because of this idea of, it's all up for interpretation. People have different ways of reading this book, and there's not, a certain set of messages that this provides. You get to decide what message it provides. It's this relativism in the realm of interpretation that I always found to be unsettling as a student. Because we're almost out of time, unfortunately, with this interview, I want to turn to your chapter to close this out on wonder and longing. And you talked about this earlier in our discussion, but you said in the beginning of that chapter that Aristotle saw that each and every one of us longs to know, truly know, thousands of things. I love that quote because sometimes there's this impression that there are some students who are more curious than others or some students who are smarter than others. And I think that everyone has that desire to learn things, but it has to be ignited largely by teachers and professors. And you list in the book on page 129, if anybody's following along, it's like an academic seminar I'm leading here, how ironic. No, but I love this because you list some of these things that we human beings long to understand. You write, who am I? Why am I? Does my life, do our lives have a purpose, or is life random? What should I do to be a good person? Why should I want to be a good person? Does the universe have a creator? If it does he care? What makes something beautiful or noble? To continue on, I wonder if it's true that all men are created equal. What do those words even mean? It sounds so primitive in retrospect, but I never really understood that this was part of the point of education, to consider these questions about yourself and how you fit into life. I always thought that that was sort of stuff that you pondered after school. You went to school to learn practical skills, practical things, and then maybe when you went home, you could contemplate why you were born in the year that you were born or what it means to be a human being. And I don't think I even fully got it until I read that chapter of your book. And that's what's so sad, because I wish that more people, myself included earlier in my life, understood that this is a huge component of education. Not just learning addition and subtraction or similes and metaphors or what years the Vietnam War occurred, but to contemplate your existence.
Yes.
That's my sermon.
It's
So
sort of
you-
like the old joke about the student who said, "I didn't know you could learn about something about love by reading Shakespeare. I thought you had to go to Google."
Oh God, so sad.
And yeah, you could. Shakespeare. Let's go. Let's sort of end on Shakespeare. No, maybe not end. Maybe I'll say something after Shakespeare. Shakespeare is just an amazing understanding and understander of what it means to be human, with all its ups and its downs, all the things that should concern you, all the things that might give you joy. He understands what it means to be tragic. He understands what it means to be a friend. He understands what it means to be corrupt, or to be cynical, or to be a traitor to your friends. He understands men and women together. He understands men and women separately. The and is it teaching? Yes, it's teaching, but more it's just displaying. Here's what you ask questions. You pick up Merchant of Venice. I mentioned that before, but in a different context. And you say, Shylock, why is a person who's so terrible? Why do I feel so bad for him? Why is he so sympathetic while at the same time he seems so mean? Uh, Take that apart. Think about that. Think about the different parts of the human soul. Uh, why is it that there's both a glorification and a critique of Christianity in the Merchant of Venice? Uh, these things that we want to know about. What do I need to be a just and good human being? What do I need to what do I owe my parents? What do they in fact owe me? What do I owe my country? Is there something my country owes me? These are things that we all want to know about. But I want to take it just one step further, because right now, and I'll end on this if I may. We've been talking about the learning and us as individuals, as individual humans. And I have a whole section in there on how without liberal education, the founding fathers could never have made this country. I mean, they not only the putting together of the Constitution, but Madison going and finding everything he could find about ancient and modern confederacies and what made them work and what made them fail. Jefferson trying to understand what makes for lasting liberty and what makes for just license or corruption. They want to know how to build republics and what killed republics, what dangers there were. They wanted to know what institutions might help preserve it and preserve it justly. And they wanted to know everything that they say about it in the preamble. How to secure justice, how to promote national peace, how to promote unity. What do we need to do? And after I wrote that, I said, I even wrote an essay once on America was the first liberal arts nation. We didn't become a country by accident or by chance, as Hamilton says. We became a country by thought. But then I was struck with the problem. All right, look, it was important for important that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson that they knew history, that they knew philosophy, that they knew human nature, that they knew politics. And we don't have to know that stuff. The trouble is, they made a nation where they're not ruling anymore. We're ruling, me and you and everybody in the listening audience. And if we don't know what American history is about, if we don't know why America is, if we don't know what makes America exceptional and what makes America great and what makes America problematic in the world, why is it that sometimes we think all the world wants to be America, and sometimes we look around and say, why don't they want to be America? Unless we understand what we are, unless we understand our history, our culture, our philosophy, the ideology of our founding, the values and meanings of our founding, unless we understand what democracies can do well, what democracies can't do at all. Uh, I was always struck when I was in Iraq by people who say half the country wanted to be Americans. The other half said, under no circumstances. I'm afraid. You're going to put me out there and I got to work myself. I get rewarded on the basis of what I do, what I make, what I can achieve. Yes, you'll give me the opportunity to do it. What's going to happen to me if I fail? I'm afraid of freedom. I want to do what my leaders tell me, what my tribe tells me, what my parents tell me, what my imam tells me. That's security. And unless we understand things like that, what makes for the value and the virtue and the joy of living a democratic life, and what the problems of it are, why it's not always we can't explain it anymore. We've forgotten how to explain what we are, who we are, and why we are.
Yes.
And if you can't explain it, you ain't going to win.
In addition to your book on essays, you should write a book on your time in Iraq and what you learned from the students.
I did.
Oh.
I wrote a book called Mugged by Reality back in 2004 or 5, something like that.
You can see what a
it's a great book.
You can see what a great interviewer I am, that I didn't do my homework on that. Hey, I know this book, though, back and front, though. I think I've proven that. I did my homework in this regard. I'm going to read your book on Iraq next, and we can do an interview about it. Thank you very much for coming on to Timeless, Mr. Agresto. And by the way, I loved how many times you use the word timeless in your book to describe literature. So every time
I had you in mind.
Yes.
I had you in mind. Yes.
Thank you for coming on.
This was an amazingly fine interview, and you're an amazingly fine interviewer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're just saying it because I liked your book.
No.
I'm kidding.
I got to tell you, you ask interesting questions. Or to be honest, how many interviews have I had where the person who's questioning me has not read the book? Where the first question is, what are you trying to say in this book?
What do you think should be your response?
You did your homework and you did it well, kiddo.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Julie.
I appreciate your listening. And remember, each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. See you soon, and take care.